On April 25, 1792, a man named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier became the first person in history to die beneath the guillotine's blade. The crowd watching was disappointed because it was over too fast. But some doctors didn't think so, wondering whether the brain remained conscious even after it was severed. The answers to that mystery were more disturbing than anyone expected. Before the guillotine, executions in France were deeply unequal. Wealthy nobles were usually executed with a sword, which was relatively quick and considered more dignified. Poor people faced much harsher deaths. They could be hanged, broken on a wheel, or even burned alive. The way a person died often depended more on their social class than on their crime. To many people during the French Revolution, it was just another unfair part of the old system. In 1789, a physician named Dr. Joseph-Ignace Guillotin spoke before the French National Assembly and proposed a different approach. He argued that every condemned person, no matter their social status, should be executed in the same way. His idea was a mechanical beheading that would be fast, consistent, and far less painful than existing methods. Guillotin was actually against the death penalty altogether, but as long as executions continued, he wanted them to be as humane as possible. The machine that later carried his name was not actually built by him. In 1792, a German harpsichord maker named Tobias Schmidt constructed it using designs created by Dr. Antoine Louis, the secretary of the French Academy of Surgery. Before it was used on living persons, it was tested on human corpses at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris in April 1792. The tests were successful. Only months after the first guillotine executions, the machine became the symbol of one of the bloodiest periods in French history. Between September 1793 and July 1794, during the period known as the Reign of Terror, about 17,000 people were officially executed across France. Roughly 2,700 of those executions took place in Paris alone, under the guillotine. The blades fell almost every day, and crowds often gathered by the thousands to watch. As these executions became more common, people working around the scaffold began noticing strange things. Severed heads appeared to move, eyes seemed to open and close, mouths moved silently. Some faces even appeared to change expression. Most doctors believed there was a simple explanation. They argued these movements were only muscle spasms. When the nervous system suffers a massive injury, muscles can contract randomly. The moments may look meaningful, but according to this explanation, they're not signs of awareness or consciousness. Most physicians accepted that answer and moved on. A few were not convinced. In 1795, a German professor named Samuel Thomas von Simmering published a paper that immediately attracted attention. His argument was that the brain needs blood to function, but blood does not disappear from the brain the instant a head is separated from the body. For a short period of time, possibly several seconds, the brain might still contain enough oxygen and energy to remain active. If that was true, then consciousness might continue briefly after decapitation. Most of his colleagues dismissed the idea as speculation. One execution more than any other pushed this debate into public view, and it happened even before Simmering published his paper. On July 17, 1793, a 24-year-old woman named Charlotte Corday was executed by guillotine in Paris. 4 days earlier, she had assassinated Jean-Paul Marat, one of the most radical leaders of the French Revolution, by stabbing him while he sat in his medicinal bath. Witnesses later described Corday as remarkably calm as she walked to the scaffold. After the blade fell and her head landed in the basket, an assistant executioner named François Legros picked it up and slapped it across the face. Some accounts say he did it out of contempt. Others claim he wanted to demonstrate something to the crowd. What reportedly happened next shocked everyone watching. According to multiple witnesses, Corday's face appeared to react. Her cheeks reportedly turned red, and her expression seemed to change into one of anger or indignation. The debate that followed was intense. Doctors argued about the incident in pamphlets and medical journals. Those who rejected the story said that the slap simply triggered muscle contractions. In their view, the movement was mechanical and had nothing to do with awareness or feeling. Others disagreed. They pointed out that reddening of the cheeks involved blood vessels, not just muscles. A severed head no longer has a heart pumping blood through the body. If the face truly changed color, they argued, then a simple muscle spasm might not fully explain what happened. No scientific agreement was ever reached. But the execution of Charlotte Corday transformed what had been a small medical debate into a major public controversy. By the early 1800s, some doctors had moved beyond simply debating the question. They wanted to investigate it directly. In 1803, a French physician named Pierre Sue published the most complete review of the evidence collected up to that point. He gathered witness accounts and medical observations from the previous decade into a single document. Among the reports he included were several claims that severed heads appeared to react when their names were called. Witnesses described eyes moving and facial muscles tightening during the first few seconds after execution. Around the same time, a doctor named Séguret carried out what were probably the first deliberate experiments on freshly guillotined heads. Working only seconds after executions, he exposed the heads to ammonia, a powerful chemical irritant that normally causes an immediate reaction in living tissue. He also applied pressure to the eyeballs. In a living person, this can create the sensation of flashing lights and often triggers a reflex blink. Séguret reported seeing facial reactions to both forms of stimulation. He was careful not to make claims he couldn't prove. He admitted that the reactions might simply have been reflexes. In other words, they could have been automatic responses from still living nerve tissue rather than signs of conscious awareness. But he recorded one detail that would attract attention for generations. The reactions gradually weakened and disappeared within about 30 seconds of decapitation. After that point, no amount of stimulation produced any response. For several decades after Séguret's work, the debate faded into the background. The guillotine remained in regular use throughout France, but while executions continued, scientists were learning far more about how the brain and nervous system actually worked. In 1853, German physiologist Eduard Pfluger published important research showing that the spinal cord could produce surprisingly complex movements even without help from the brain. In one experiment, a frog that had been decapitated could still perform what looked like a deliberate scratching motion when its skin was irritated. This discovery gave strong support to those who believed the movements seen in severed heads were only reflexes. A response could look purposeful without involving consciousness at all. As long as nerve tissue remained alive, movement was still possible. But not everyone agreed. In 1879, a French physician named Dacy de Lignières challenged this explanation. Working with freshly severed heads immediately after executions, he pressed his fingers against the carotid arteries in the neck, the major blood vessels that normally carry blood to the brain. His goal was to imitate the return of circulation. He reported that facial muscles seemed to tighten and that the eyes appeared to focus when he did this. He believed the reactions were too specific to be explained by random nerve activity alone. His critics raised an important objection. Words like appeared and seemed are not scientific measurements. At the time, there were no instruments capable of objectively measuring what was happening inside the brain. That made it difficult to separate a real neurological response from an observer simply seeing what they expected to see. Humans are extremely good at finding patterns and meaning in random movements, especially when they're already looking for evidence and standing over a freshly severed human head. The problem wasn't lack of interest. The problem was that nobody had developed a method reliable enough to settle the question. The most famous and controversial experiment in this entire debate took place on a summer morning in 1905. A convicted murderer named Henri Languille was scheduled to be executed by guillotine. A French physician named Dr. Gabriel Bourriot arranged to stand directly beside the scaffold so he could observe the head within seconds of decapitation. He had a specific plan. As soon as the blade fell, he would repeatedly call Languille's name and watch for any response. The moment the head dropped, Bourriot began calling out Languille's name loud and clear. According to Bourriot's published report, something remarkable happened. On the second call, the eyelids, which had been closed, lifted. The eyes appeared to focus directly on him. He didn't describe it as a random twitch or wandering movement. Instead, he believed it looked like a deliberate gaze directed toward the sound of his voice. A few moments later, the eyes closed again. He called the name a third time. Once again, the eyelids opened. Once again, the eyes appeared to focus before gradually losing that focus. When he called the name a fourth time, there was no reaction at all. Borrell estimated that the entire period of apparent responsiveness lasted between 25 and 30 seconds after decapitation. Shortly afterward, he published a detailed report in a French medical journal. He carefully distinguished between the unfocused movements that occurred immediately after decapitation and what he believed were more deliberate responses later on. The first type, he thought, could be explained by simple reflexes. The second type seemed different. Directing the eyes toward a specific sound normally involves parts of the brain such as the superior colliculus and the visual cortex. It's not something the spinal cord can do by itself. If the movement really was directed, then it would require an explanation beyond a simple reflex. Even so, Borrell never claimed he had proven consciousness survived decapitation. He only described what he'd observed and encouraged others to repeat the experiment. The problem was that repeating it was extremely difficult. The window of time was incredibly short, and even a delay of a few seconds could ruin the observation. By the early 1900s, ethical concerns also made formal experiments at execution sites increasingly difficult to justify. While doctors argued about observations made at execution sites, laboratory scientists were building a much clearer understanding of how the brain actually functions. The human brain is the most oxygen-dependent organ in the body. Even though it makes up only about 2% of total body weight, it uses roughly 20% of the body's oxygen supply. Unlike muscles, which can continue functioning for a short time using stored energy, the brain has almost no reserve supply. When blood flow suddenly stops, as it would during decapitation, the only oxygen available is whatever remains inside the brain's blood vessels. Based on measured oxygen consumption rates, that supply is usually exhausted within about 10 to 15 seconds. A major breakthrough came in 1924 when German psychiatrist Hans Berger recorded the first human brainwave using a device called an electroencephalogram, better known as an EEG. For the first time, scientists had a tool that could directly measure electrical activity in the brain instead of relying solely on visible behavior. By the 1940s and 1950s, researchers studying patients who suffered sudden cardiac arrest discovered that measurable EEG activity usually disappeared within 20 to 40 seconds after blood circulation stopped. Cardiac arrest creates the same basic problem seen in decapitation, where blood can no longer reach the brain. What caught researchers' attention was how closely these findings matched the older reports. The EEG studies pointed to a period of about 20 to 40 seconds, while many of the historical observations had repeatedly suggested a window of about 25 to 30 seconds. The physiological evidence and the eyewitness reports appeared to be describing the same underlying biological process. There was one important complication, however. The disappearance of measurable brain waves does not necessarily mean every brain cell has stopped functioning. It also doesn't tell scientists the exact moment consciousness ends. An EEG measures large-scale electrical activity across the brain. Some researchers argued that a lower level of activity might continue for a few seconds after the EEG becomes flat, potentially allowing for a brief period of awareness. Others argued the opposite. In their view, consciousness depends on the large, organized patterns that the EEG detects. Once those patterns disappear, awareness disappears with them. The debate had become far more scientific than it had been a century earlier. Because controlled experiments on humans were impossible for ethical reasons, scientists turned to animals. Researchers conducted studies on rats, rabbits, and other mammals under carefully controlled laboratory conditions. Before decapitation, they attached EEG electrodes to monitor brain activity. For the first time, scientists could measure what the brain was actually doing from the exact moment decapitation occurred. Several research teams studying decapitated rats during the 1950s and 1960s found that activity in the cerebral cortex continued for a measurable period after decapitation. The cerebral cortex is the part of the brain most closely linked to thinking, perception, and awareness. In many cases, brain activity lasted between 13 and 30 seconds. The most advanced animal study in this area came in 1988. Researchers combined EEG monitoring with a technology called near-infrared spectroscopy, which measures oxygen levels inside living tissue in real time. Using decapitated rats, they tracked both brain activity and oxygen levels at the same time. What they found was important. Brain activity dropped rapidly during the first 10 seconds after decapitation, but it didn't disappear immediately. Instead, it faded gradually. In some animals, Measurable brain signals remained for up to 29 seconds. The timeline matched oxygen loss almost perfectly. The brain remained active until its oxygen supply was exhausted. After that, the activity stopped. Of course, a rat's brain is not the same as a human brain. Whatever a rat experiences during those final seconds is unlikely to resemble human awareness. But the biological process itself is very similar across mammals. For many years, the animal studies and the historical reports from human executions remained separate areas of research. Then two studies, published only 2 years apart, brought the debate into the modern scientific era. In 2011, a team of Dutch neuroscientists, led by Dr. Berend Rombouts at Leiden University, studied patients who suffered cardiac arrest during surgery. The researchers discovered something unexpected. In several patients, they recorded a sudden surge of electrical activity in the brain immediately after circulation stopped. Later researchers sometimes referred to this phenomenon as a death wave. The findings showed that the brain doesn't simply switch off the moment blood flow ends. Instead, it appears to go through a final burst of activity first. Whether this burst creates any kind of conscious experience is impossible to determine from EEG readings alone. But the discovery made it much harder for scientists to argue that awareness ends instantly when circulation stops. Then, in 2013, a team led by Dr. Jimo Borjigan at the University of Michigan published a study that attracted worldwide attention. Using rats that had undergone cardiac arrest, the researchers recorded a powerful surge of gamma waves during the 30 seconds after the heart stopped. Gamma waves are a type of brain activity that's strongly associated with conscious perception in humans. What surprised the researchers was that the gamma activity was actually stronger than what the same rats showed during normal waking life. The scientists were careful about their conclusions. They didn't claim the rats were conscious. High gamma activity is associated with awareness, but it doesn't prove awareness exists. The strongest and most carefully collected evidence in this entire story arrived in 2023. The study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Scientists and was led by Dr. Jimo Borjigan, the same researcher who led the 2013 rat study. This time, however, the subjects were human. 4 intensive care patients were already connected to high-resolution EEG monitors as part of their medical treatment. All 4 experienced cardiac arrest while being monitored. In 2 of the 4 patients, researchers recorded a surge of gamma wave activity shortly after life support was withdrawn. The activity appeared in brain regions closely associated with dreaming, visual processing, and conscious awareness. More specifically, the activity occurred where the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes meet. Neuroscientists consider this area particularly important for conscious experience. The burst of activity appeared within seconds of cardiac arrest and lasted roughly 30 to 60 seconds before fading away. The researchers stressed that 4 patients is a very small sample size and not enough to reach definitive conclusions. Even so, the findings closely matched the results from the 2013 rat study. But there is one major difference. During cardiac arrest, the head remains attached to the body, and some blood pressure remains in the brain's blood vessels for a short time. A severed head loses that pressure almost immediately. This means any period of possible awareness after decapitation would likely be shorter than after cardiac arrest. At this point, it's important to define what scientists mean when they talk about consciousness in this situation. Researchers aren't suggesting that a severed head spends its final moments calmly thinking, understanding what has happened, or carrying an internal conversation. The science does not support that idea. Instead, the evidence points towards something much simpler. There may be a brief period during which the brain continues producing electrical activity linked to sensory processing and basic awareness. Whether this creates any actual experience, sensation, perception, or feeling remains unknown. Current technology, it may be impossible to know for certain. The 2 leading scientific theories of consciousness approach this question differently. The first is global workspace theory, developed by neuroscientist Bernard Bars in 1988. This theory argues that consciousness requires information to be shared across large parts of the brain at the same time. If this theory is correct, then consciousness after decapitation would probably disappear very quickly, because the brain's network begins breaking down almost immediately. The second is integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi in 2004. This theory focuses on whether brain activity remains organized and connected enough to function as a unified system, As neurons lose energy and begin shutting down, that integration would rapidly collapse. Despite their differences, researchers generally agree on one point. Whatever may or may not be happening after decapitation ends within about 30 seconds. After that, the brain's energy supply is gone. No major scientific theory currently suggests that awareness could continue beyond that.